Welcome everybody to today's Textile Talk. It is brought to you by these organizations, and today this Textile Talk is being brought to you by Studio Art Quilt Associates, or SAQA. We are a membership organization. We have about 4,200 members in countries around the world. And one of the things that we provide for our members is the opportunity to participate in exhibitions which travel the world. And we're going to share one of those with you today. I see that we are already at 343 people attending today's webinar. And I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us in this series of Textile Talks. We're coming up on having produced 100 Textile Talks. We're going to have a big celebration in May. And it's just been the most wonderful thing for our entire community to be able to come together every week to enjoy the wonderful art that we love. So Lucy, you want to go to the next screen? I wanted to invite all of you to consider attending SAQA's upcoming virtual conference, Bridging the Gulf. This is one of the membership benefits of being a member of SAQA. If you would like to become a member of SAQA, if you use the discount code TALKS, you'll get money off of the regular membership price, and then you can be eligible to attend the conference. We have an incredible lineup of speakers and presentations and panels and opportunities to network and get to spend time with your fellow fiber art enthusiasts. And if you would like to know more about the conference, just go to the website, saqa.com/virtual, and the full lineup, the schedule, and all of the information is there. So today, we are talking to you about artists from Fur, Fang, Feathers, and Fins, also sometimes known within the staff as FFFF. And we're going to be able to speak with three of the artists: Sara Sharp, Cindy Richard, and Lulu Murakami. If you would like to see the other pieces of art in the exhibition and to read about them, they are all on the SAQA website. You can either go to saqa.com/furfangs or saqa.com/FFFF. So each of the artists is going to give you a brief presentation about their inspiration and their working methods. As you watch the presentation, if you have questions, please just type them into the chat or into the Q&A. And then after the third presentation, I will be asking the artists your questions until we run out of time. The presentations are wonderful, and I know you're going to come away feeling very inspired. One last thing, if you are going to QuiltCon, SAQA will have a booth there, number 630, and we will have some of the actual art from Fur, Fang, Feathers, and Fins at our booth, so you'll get to see it in person. And now I would like to introduce Sara Sharp, who'll be talking to you about her work. Go ahead, Sara.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sara Sharp, and I live in Austin, Texas, and I'm a juried member of Studio Art Quilt Associates, and I create fabric collages accented with free motion quilting and a lot of heavy thread painting. My original training was as a painter, and I created pastel paintings for about 20 years. I discovered art quilting about 15 years ago, and since then that has been the only kind of work I do, and I love it. I work at my own home studio and sew with my little home Bernina sewing machine. I love photography and bird watching. So many of my quilts feature the birds who were inspired by my photographs. And so none of my quilts are just photos printed on fabric, but I do use some photographic techniques in creating my pieces. You can go to the first slide. Next picture. Okay, this is Coastal Cousins, and this is the piece that is in that current exhibit. Okay, my beginning of a quilt, after I find a wonderful photo in my collection, is to look at the color photo and go through my giant fabric stash to pull out all the fabrics, colors, prints, textures, and so on that look like they might fit in this, depicting this scene. And I lay all those out in color groups. And that's my inspiration. Then I use my large format printer, and you'll find out why for that in a moment, but I use my large format printer to print out in black and white, a very enlarged copy of the scene I'm planning on. And this would be after I've done any editing or cropping to the picture. So that's printed out on my computer, enlarged. Then I use that pattern copy on paper and set it over my large flat light box. Then I will trace around the edges of all the color areas in the picture, in the pattern, with a marker so I can see them well. Then I take a piece of fusible and trace those shapes onto the fusible product. Each of those pieces is cut out and ironed onto the back of the fabrics I'm using in all the parts of the picture. So this particular piece was based on a photograph I took where there was a white and a brown pelican swimming right next to each other, which doesn't often happen, but they looked so good. I wanted them to be a focal point of a quilt. And it is very important to me to have a clear focal point and a focus of the interest of the viewer in the quilt. My favorite way of accomplishing that is by using heavy thread painting on those focal point elements. And I will be describing a little more about how I do that. Using my paper pattern, I'm cut out shapes that can be placed on top of the outline of each bird, because I create the birds on a separate piece of fabric from the final quilt. So I will cut out and applique on parts of the picture on top of the bird shape. And then when that's done, I use scores and scores of different colors and types of thread to do heavy thread painting all over the figure. Once that image is completed, now you can go to the next photo. This is a close-up of the brown pelican. And after I've finished all this heavy thread painting where I'm blending and mixing and layering colors of thread, then I will carefully cut out that image from the background piece of fabric and carefully snip it out, place it on my background, and applique it on my machine with invisible thread. Let's go to the next picture. This one is called Nursery Loft, and it's one of my favorites. This was made from a picture I took on the Texas Gulf Coast, where I love birding in the spring. And these two great blue herons were building a nest for their upcoming eggs. And they were building it on old leftover equipment from at an old unused boat dock or a shipyard, I guess you would say. And my focal point here was the two herons. So I constructed those two pieces independently from the background. Once again, piecing together different colors of fabric to form them, and then doing my heavy thread painting. You can go to the next slide. And this shows some of the stitching on the birds themselves. On this one, I also did a lot of heavy free motion quilting and machine accents on all of the, the old equipment on which they were building their nest. All right, next slide. This one is called Can We Save the Whooping Cranes? And its unusual appearance is because it shows on the left side of the quilt what life is like in the habitat of the whooping cranes, who are still endangered to this day. But on the left is their ideal habitat, and on the right is what will happen if we don't protect the flow of fresh water from the rivers into the bays. Next slide. This quilt also, I created the birds separately. And one of the things I failed to mention was every time I do a separate image of a bird, I place heavy weight stabilizer ironed onto the back of that piece of fabric. And that's because if I do the heavy thread painting without that, it can cause the fabric it's on to pucker up, and it will cause it to be disfigured. So heavy stabilizer on the back of the bird. Then I do my heavy thread painting, cut it out, and place it on the background. And in this one, the landscape scene behind the birds was one I just designed myself on paper and then cut out the parts and assembled it afterwards. And you can see on this slide a lot of free motion quilting to accent the waves and the grasses in the foreground. Next slide. This is just a single picture of another quilt with birds on it. And this one is slightly different because it was composed from two different photographs. I had a photograph I had taken on vacation of the two hummingbirds, and I had a photograph I had taken of the flowering plant, the milkweed, in my backyard. So I combined those two photos to create this picture. Once again, I created the hummingbirds separately, heavily thread painted them, and I did the same thing with the cluster of flowers, then cut them out and applied them to the background scene. I did the large abstracted leaves from a drawing I had made to add to the picture. And one of the things that really makes this picture work, and if you look closely, you will see it, and something to think about when you're combining two different photographs, I created shadows of all of the objects, and I had to picture the source of the sunlight, the direction from which it was coming. And by painting the shadows underneath each object, it added a lot of three-dimensionality to all the items in the picture. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. I will turn it over to Cindy.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Martha, for asking me to join you today. It is an honor to address my fellow SAQA members. I've been quilting for the last 26 years, ever since I moved across the world to Israel from New York. During these last 10 years, I've been working on art quilts in my home studio. When I look back at my beginning work compared with what I create today, I almost feel embarrassed. But we must grow from a starting place, and that is what I set my mind to do. I studied drawing and anatomy from an artistic viewpoint with a local artist, and I learned a ton. Then I tried my hand at creating faces in fabric based on a layered collage technique taught by my mentor, Phyllis Cullen. This quilt, Happy at 60, is my self-portrait using this technique. Notice the fabrics don't have to be solids or even skin tones for the result to be believable. The quilt is based on the reference photo you see on the left. Can you see the likeness? I realized there was no available instruction on actually quilting faces. So Phyllis and I collaborated to write a book called It's All About the Face. Lots of people were working on layered collage, but no one had raised the bar to enable stitching to follow the contours of bone structure the way artists use a pencil or paint. We formed a Facebook group also called It's All About the Face, where 4,300 artists gathered to share their interpretations of fabric portraiture. It's a really inspiring, supportive environment. My current portfolio displays a number of my latest works, portraits of animals and people. They're all done as layered collage, raw edge applique, and then contour quilted according to the underlying bone structure. They all tell a story. That's the point of portraiture, isn't it? So come with me while I take you on my journey through each story. During these strange COVID days, I felt a lacking in true inspiration from beyond our limited locale. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. Anyway, I found myself in need of material to work with, and so I turned to my family, particularly my grandkids. I tried to capture special moments, although sometimes they were fairly commonplace. But as their grandma, I found these events sweet enough to memorialize them as quilts. This monkey is my flagship quilt for this talk, Monkey Business, as it is part of SAQA's show, Furs, Fangs, Feathers, and Fins. I chose to photograph him because of his exasperated expression. He sat down beside this tree and just stared back at us. I could see he was a monkey with an attitude. This is an example of the process I follow. I look for an engaging composition that I think will make an eye-catching quilt. I take a lot of photos and then I crop the best ones in terms of lighting, clarity, and interest. I break down the photo according to value using digital manipulation in Photoshop Elements and produce a pattern. Each value is cut out of a corresponding fabric and layered according to the pattern to create the completed form. And then the work is assembled with contour quilting. This is a close-up of Monkey Business, which really shows his exasperated expression. Notice the texture of his fur. It's all contour thread work, done with variegated thread. His eyes are watching us. They came alive when I added a catch light in each eye. By working with value, I am able to create the illusion of 3 dimensions. Caged In shows a lonely elephant in captivity. He's staring at the viewer from behind bars. I wanted this work to raise an awareness of animal rights and the treatment of all animals by evoking shock from the viewer and send a message. A picture really can speak 1,000 words. By the way, this work was awarded first place in the challenge alone by the Israel Quilters Association and is currently showing in the Jerusalem Theater. The composition of a partial view of an animal emphasizes the bold, sad eye between bars, as you can see in this close-up. The color palette of muted, somber colors supports the theme, although you will notice that he isn't gray, so I did take some artistic license. The elephant is made from 4 value layers. I cut out the values and created a kind of lace from each fabric. I combined the 4 fabrics by laying each one on the other in precisely the correct position. If you don't do that, you get like a moire effect. That was how I could bring out all the wrinkles in his hide. Elephants in particular have a lot of wrinkles and creases. They say a dog is man's best friend. They are best buddies. My son has always had a great connection to animals, particularly dogs. In Best Buddies, I tried to show the deep and meaningful love between these two with a touch of humor. The background supports the angular positioning of the 2 figures. They really are a great pair. Can you see the resemblance in this close-up? Both faces are layered collages with curved contour quilting, which shows the rounded shapes of their features without outlining or sewing around any of the patches on their faces. You can see the fabric peeking through the thread work. I don't try to cover the fabric layers. I want the fabric and the thread to work together to show depth and dimension. When deciding on a composition, I am always aware of elements such as light, shadow, value, and bone structure. But the most important lesson is noticing the small nuances at the end of the process. A slight tilt of the head, a subtle smile on one side of the face, a dimple, a wink. The tweak could be a millimeter, but that speaks miles. This piece of my son-in-law called Hard at Work, while he drilled into the wall, is really quite commonplace. But there is a kind of tension in the art. How he is holding the drill and concentrating, and the shadow he cast on the wall are all details I discovered by really focusing on the photo. In this close-up of the drill in Hard at Work, you can see that the drill is made of jeans fabric, which I chose because of the rugged quality of denim. The shadows are done with layers of tulle, one of my favorite fabrics. As a matter of fact, I always say tulle is my friend. The background is raw applique of combined torn strips of neutral fabrics. I usually quilt the backgrounds first, and then I layer each element on the quilt. I sew on a handy quilter Amara long arm and on a Bernina 720 for all my free motion work. This composition is a typical headshot of 2 beautiful women who are almost identical. Actually, the only identical feature of our twins are the shape of their eyes and the shapes of their noses. The contour quilting emphasizes their features, especially their blue and green eyes. The fabric choices for their hair brings out the reflected light that's shining on them from above. The drape of their clothing is accentuated by the contour quilting. In this close-up of almost identical, you can again see the contour quilting. Look at her sparkling green eyes and the shine on her hair. Notice that I do very little sewing on the teeth. We don't want them turning into piano keys, so I do not accentuate each tooth. These portraits look best when viewed from a bit of a distance. Then you can see what the contrast of values really does to bring out the fullness of the features. There's so much more to talk about on the fascinating subject of portraiture. By the way, who says portraits need to be faces? So Phyllis and I are working on a second book called More Than Just a Pretty Face, where we will be discussing many more in-depth topics. Anyway, thanks for this opportunity to address you. Please allow me to introduce our next speaker, Lulu Moonwood Murakami.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. Hello, I'm Lulu Moonwood Murakami, and you can let me know if it's showing yet. I hope so. So I'd also like to start by thanking SAQA, Textile Talks, and the sponsors. I've been enjoying Textile Talks ever since they began. And participating today is sort of a dream of mine come true. Today, I'd like to take you through parts of the emotional fairy tale that led to the making of my quilt for this show. Grammy Ruth, my paternal grandmother, was an accomplished seamstress and maker of all things textiles, such as this cathedral windows quilt on the left. However, on my annual visits to her home, she never once showed me how to do any of those textile marvels. Instead, I mostly played in her garden under the weeping willow tree, where a sense of magic and security allowed my imagination to grow. My mother could also sew, but funny enough, she only pulled the old sewing machine when I was away at Grammy's house. Yet despite this lack of previous generations sharing with me their textile knowledge, I still inherited a desire to play with thread and cloth. On the right is Giovanni, the first doll I ever made. He was a gift from my mother. She loved him, so I went on making things, believing that I could. In high school, full of confidence in art class, the teacher suggested I should be an art major in college. So I said, okay. But when I got there, a very mean and cruel drawing teacher laughed at my drawings. I decided that if I couldn't draw, then I would weave. I wove tapestries and rugs and scarves, and then I wove this, a walk in the wood. This was my Bachelor of Fine Arts final project, a big floor-to-ceiling installation made of handmade felts and woven nets. It represented a decaying forest I had visited, which encapsulated so many emotions about all the obstacles I'd already confronted in my life, those dark parts of my personal fairy tale. Once I graduated with my BFA, I thought I would be a professional weaver, but that was not to be. Earning my keep as a picture framer, one day I learned about Arrowmont School of Arts and Crafts and signed up for a quilting class. My very first quilting teacher was Terry Hancock Mangan. And here is my very first ever quilt. It's a tracing of my own body surrounded by many of Terry's colorful fabrics. I call it my empowerment quilt because that's how it made me feel. Now you might notice it's still a UFO, but it did lead to other pieces that are finished. This theme of female empowerment, ritual, and dance carried over into several other pieces, including these. River Dance on the left is all hand-pieced, and then Dancing by the Light of the Mambo Moon on the right is a combination. Both pieces include beading, and the large one on the right also includes paint. I really love the mixed media aspect of these quilts, and that carried over into my doll making. Doll making was an art form that wove in and out of my life. I've gone through many phases of making many, many, many dolls. These are textile mixed with paper clay and paints. But I wanted to do something different with my dolls. I wanted to go deeper, weirder, more experimental. I discovered that I love sketching lines with my sewing machine, and I had fun, especially around the eyes of these dolls. And I started applying these sketchy lines to some of my quilts. I really love the energy that the lines suggest. On the left is the Green Gate, and on the right is Memory of a Tibetan Door. I was feeling productive during this time, but current events caused me to pause and take stock of what was going on in the world. I'd never been a person to speak out very much, but the time came when I felt that I needed to speak my truth. In November of 2016, it seemed like the world turned upside down. For 4.5 years, there was a new catastrophe or controversy every week. Channeling my frustration through my art was the only thing keeping me sane. On the left is a mixed media piece entitled All Bottled Up, and on the right, a crazy quilt for crazy times. Even my doll making at this time became an outlet for all the turmoil I was feeling. I was feeling trapped, feeling like I needed things to happen to rectify the situation. On the left is Pulgarcito y la chica de muchos dientes, or Tom Thumb and the girl with many, many teeth. And on the right is Se puede soñar, one can dream. The passing of John Lewis brought about a shift of emotion. I felt a deep sadness at the loss of this truly courageous man, but making this memorial quilt filled me with a comforting sense of love and admiration. As you've probably noticed in much of my work, faces often convey the emotion of the piece. This quilt, My Guardian Angel, was my response to a call for art from SAQA, Oregon, to participate in a book project which has now been published. The imagery recalls a very dark time in my life and a stranger's gentle offer of comfort. 2020. For our SAQA Regional Conference in Oregon, which couldn't happen until 2021, we were invited to participate in a collaboration project for an exhibition. My friend Tina Ryan and I discussed many ideas inspired by our passionate responses to everything going on in the world, not only COVID-19, but politics and social injustice. One day, as we met on Zoom, Tina struck this pose and I said, "Tina, that's it." I took a screenshot of her perfectly expressed gesture. We both created a piece from that image. She made a quilt entitled Our Lady of Corona, and I made this 3-dimensional piece called Tell Us How You Really Feel. And now my piece for Fur, Fangs, Feathers, and Fins. This is my renewal quilt. While the pandemic has been devastating in so many ways, for me, it's also had a silver lining. For a while, the world became very quiet. During lockdown, my husband and I were still able to go out every day and take a walk in the woods with our 3 dogs. Along with all the beautiful plants and trees, I was seeing so many animals, especially rabbits. They were everywhere. It was as if they knew that the world was suddenly safer for them. It reminded me of the security I felt as a child under Grammy's willow tree. This reimmersion with nature coincided with new creative communities coming together online, and I so appreciate those communities. It was a joy to create and share with others, and these 2 phenomena came together for me and inspired this quilt. The quilt was completely stitched by hand in peaceful meditation. It includes applique, reverse applique, embroidery, and quilting. Here's another detail. It would be lovely if this were a new direction for my work to take. A sense of wonder and magic, and a renewed sense of hope and optimism. Thank you so much for letting me share.
Oh, thank you. That was a beautiful way to end our presentation. Cindy and Sarah, if you would turn on your video cameras and your microphones. We have a lot of questions from the audience that they'd love to hear from you about. All right, wonderful. Okay. So I wanted to start with some of the technical terms because some of the people in the audience have asked for greater explanation. So Sarah, starting with you, they wanted to know what is thread painting?
Oh, okay. Well, it's my favorite thing to do, as I say, to accentuate my center of interest in a quilt. Thread painting, I wish I had shown you a picture of it. When I'm doing thread painting, I will have like 4 bins full of threads, categorized by color and type. I use some cotton blend, some rayon, depending on the look I want. But what happens is I use my free motion foot on the machine. And after I've put stabilizer on the back of the object I'm thread painting, is really important so it doesn't pucker. Then I just go usually in contour and close together stitches, and just straight stitch. It's not set on anything unusual. Until I layer and cover the area just like you would with a brush and paint. That's the best I can tell.
And sort of a follow-up, we are currently running SAQA Seminar, which is an educational program for SAQA members. And one of our first presentations was about what kind of sewing machine needle to use for different kinds of things. So when you're stitching through all those layers of thread, what's your go-to needle?
Currently, I'm usually using a fairly small size, I'm trying to say Microtech. What am I trying to think of?
Microtech is one of the ones that was recommended. So that's great to know.
A 70 or 80 size needle.
Okay, great, thank you.
You have to replace them fairly often.
I'll bet.
It will.
Because you're stitching through so many layers of thread that your needle's going to wear out a lot faster. And then Cindy, the question for you was, would you explain contour stitching? Because that's a term that not everybody was familiar with.
Okay, sure. So contour stitching is basically following the bone structure of the face or animal that you're working on. And so if you move your hand over your face, you can feel where it goes up and down. And I try with the stitching to follow that route so that it's actually going up and down, and you build the features out of thread work, even if there isn't fabric or there aren't exact lines for a nose. But by going around the cheeks and over the nose and then again around the cheeks, then it forms the features.
And do you find it more difficult to do that when you're portraying children compared to adults? Because sometimes some of the portraits I've seen of children, it looks like they're prematurely wrinkled.
Right, it can do that. So for children, I try to do very light colored threads so you don't see dark lines, because that's really lending towards the wrinkles. And for adults, you can, have some of the lines be farther apart. Sometimes that helps. You can use clear also to just show the texture and the line rather than having color.
And Lulu, you shared so many of your dolls. What do you use to make the heads and hands?
So on the cloth and clay dolls, I'm using an actual doll body that I make out of cloth. and I stuff it very hard, very firm. And then I apply creative paper clay is the product that I really love over that. And then when
Okay.
it's all dry, I paint.
I hadn't heard of creative paper clay, so I'll have to check that out. That sounds really interesting. All right. Sarah, I know that you take hundreds of photos of your birds. How do you choose which ones you're going to create into art?
Well, as I said, sometimes it involves editing the original picture I take so that it can establish a clear point of interest. And also good contrast is very important for doing the same thing. And I also look for interesting positions the birds are in. That adds some humor and interest, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Cindy, you also talked about looking for interesting lines and shadows, and definitely have a lot of humor. I love the piece that had your son and his dog in the same open mouth, happy position. Some of your work is very realistically colored and some is not. You know, the elephant, which was a very poignant piece, was very purple. So how do you go about making decisions about color?
Well, I'm a color person. I really like having a lot of color in my work, but I don't tend to veer that far away when I'm doing human faces. I usually stick more or less to tones that could be skin tones, but I didn't want the elephant to be gray. I didn't think that was gonna really say what I wanted to say. So I made him purple and green, but not outlandish, like it was still somber, right? But for people, I more or less stick to skin tones, but I don't use solids, and I almost always use prints because they blend way easier than solids will. If you use solids, it can almost look like you've got band-aids on their faces, and that's really a problem. It's hard to blend with thread. It's hard to just get rid of that that happening from solids.
Mm-hmm. Right, it's a very different look. Lulu, you showed both your quilts and your dolls. So obviously you're working both 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional. How do you decide what you're going to do for any particular inspiration? Wait, you're muted. I can't hear you. You need to turn your microphone off.
Sorry, I turned it off.
It's okay.
Dog was snoring. So yeah, sometimes, for example, the 3D piece I did towards the end, I had planned on doing a 2-dimensional piece for that exhibit, but then this idea came out just based on what we ultimately decided to work on for the inspiration. And in that case, just having a 3-dimensional thing to really exhibit the full depth of that emotion, I think that was the case in that one. But lots of times I just feel like, making a quilt. Sometimes I feel like making a doll.
That's right. Then the question that popped up a couple of times, many people were very moved by your quilt honoring John Lewis, and they were wondering where that quilt is now and if it's been exhibited and traveling and so on and so forth.
Well, actually, so I was just answering somebody. It's sold, and I don't know who it's sold to, but it is in somebody's collection.
Okay. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. And my follow-up question to that is, I really liked the halo that was made with all buttons. And obviously you do a lot of embellishment in your work. So do you have just an enormous stash of things to include on what you're making?
Oh, yeah. My Grammy, who I mentioned, she gave me my first button box, and I find them continually at estate sales and such, and can't resist.
Yep, I've got quite a button box myself, even though I keep trying to spread the wealth. It just keeps coming back, filling up again. Cindy, somebody asked, how come your self-portrait was in greens and blues?
I just wanted to try out using colors that were believable. Well, that the quilt would be believable, but the colors were not going to be matching skin tones. But you and I've got red hair, so the green sort of worked that way, right? But a green face, I don't know. You know, people said to me afterwards, a green face, really? But never mind. You can still tell it's me. So.
And then there was a question about the catch. First of all, what is a catch light in the eyes, and what do you use to create them?
So the catch light is the reflective light that you see in people's eyes when you look at them. Usually there's a white light that you see somewhere on the iris or on the pupil, and it's always in the same place on both eyes. And I use a white marker, actually,
Okay.
a dot from a white marker in the right place, but always I try to make sure that I'm accurate about where it is.
Mm-hmm. Right. It really brings a face to life to
Right.
have that catch light portrayed. And then Sarah, how do you choose your backgrounds?
Oh, okay. Well, it is important what you put in the background. You don't want it to detract from the main, center of interest in the quilt. Lately, I have been emphasizing the use of graduated color fabrics. And in fact, you saw that in a couple of the ones that I showed today. I just love the effect that that has. I don't know why, that's just my favorite right now.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting background without detracting from the main subject.
Yes, and it can
Mhm.
even be a print, which that one I've used several times recently is actually a small print, but it still works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then people were wondering, what kind of threads are you using in your thread painting? And I know you said you have all different threads, but if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I don't know if they're referring to brands or anything. As I said, in the thread painting, I use whatever I have, because sometimes it's such an obscure shade that I need. I will use it even if it may not be the type of thread I like, but I use, Coats and Clark plain cotton threads, blends, some of the shiny rayon and bottom line, and some of the shiny ones are great for a part that you want to be shiny and to stand out from the background. So first of all, the right color, and then secondly, the reflectiveness if I want that.
Mm-hmm. And then Cindy, there was a question. Oh wait, I've lost my train of thought. Tulle, for your shadows, you said you use a lot of tulle. And do you find it difficult to work with tulle because it can be very slippery and stuff under the needle?
It's super slippery, and you can't use fusible on it because if you iron it, it melts. So it's kind of obnoxious to work with, but it really does the job because it means you're not adding another fabric. If you want an area to be darker, you're using the same fabric that's already there. So I find that it's super effective. I've got a drawer of every color of tulle you can imagine. And it's so slippery that when I open the drawer, it pops out and it makes a huge mess every time. But if you cut out a pattern for the shape you want to use and then cut out the tulle using that pattern, it really does help. And then I pin it in place and I sew it down using, I don't know, clear thread, or I try to match the thread of the color of the tools so that you almost don't see the stitching.
Right.
And then it works effectively.
Yeah, I was very impressed with the shadow on the piece with your son-in-law with the drill. You really, it really looked like it was just a shadow. You had no sense of it being fabric and stitch. And then my final question, Lulu, is for you about the piece with the rabbits. One of the rabbits I hadn't even noticed until we were doing this presentation, and because it's just in the stitching, it isn't appliqued. And so can you talk a little bit about why you made that choice in depicting the rabbits? Why is one of them almost not there?
I like mystery. I like finding things that you don't notice at first. I think there's also a message there about, until the pandemic and really paying attention to my daily walks, I never saw rabbits out there, yet they were there, So it was just something that I loved having another shape there, but making it kind of have that multiple meaning.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So I wanted to thank all three of you. I want to thank our audience for being here. At one point, we had over 400 people, which is just so wonderful that our community can come together in this way. If you would like to see more of the pieces that are in fur, fang, feathers, and fins, I have a hard time with that one. They are on the SAQA website under art exhibitions or SAQA.com/furfangs, SAQA.com FFFF. We will be having pieces at QuiltCon in our booth, so please stop by and see them if you're going to be there. And stay tuned. We're going to show the whole slideshow again so you can see how these three beautiful pieces fit into this juried exhibition. Thank you for joining us today.